Welcome to the Revenue Rewired podcast, hosted by StringCan Interactive's visionary CEO, Jay Feitlinger, and no-nonsense COO, Sarah Shepard. We're here to accelerate your revenue and give your marketing purpose. Hello, and welcome everybody to this next episode of the Revenue Rewired podcast. Hi, Jay.
How's it going, Sarah?
So good. We are deep into January, which is it's like a whole nother season in Arizona because we're getting ready for the Waste Management Open, which
Oh,
I think this
goodness.
episode comes out like the week before. And I think, what is it known as, the Wasted Management Open? I
Exactly.
don't
And
think it
I
has a
can
very
definitely say
kind name.
I'm a victim of that a couple times.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's hard not to. It's, sun and people are on vacation, and yeah, we have a good time here in Arizona. Well, speaking of good times, we wanted to talk about some sales stuff. And Jay and I come from different backgrounds, and so sales was not ever really in my background as a deep, heavy focus, but it's been really interesting being a full-blown marketer in an agency and for the agency, how deeply the two tie together and really like they're so symbiotic, and you can't necessarily I understand one without the other. And Jay and I have had that debate in a past episode of like, where does sales start and marketing stop? And, we'd love to hear your thoughts too, because as we've shared that topic with other people, that debate has sort of continued and has become even more nuanced. Which even our own team, it was like, well, this wouldn't work for that client. And so it was kind of like, oh, this is something we need to dive into, but we'll get to that at another date. Today, we want to
Hmm.
talk about why raising revenue targets may cost you more than you think. And this one's inspired by a story that I will keep anonymous. But last week we had our annual planning meeting, so that part's not anonymous. But it was interesting in that this person messaged me this week and they forwarded me an email and said, "Hey, is this normal? I'm really upset. I don't understand. Help me before I go off a ledge here. I'm really upset." And the email was a finely written email. It wasn't great, but it was pretty clear to the point, maybe one sentence of introduction. "Hey, team, here was our sales target last year. Everybody did great. We could do better. We're going to do better. And here are your targets." And it was a bullet point list of enormous revenue targets for about 6 reps. Now, my friend is a rep where she actually has to do the estimation and the PMing and the work. So her
And
question
anything else?
was, yeah, well, pretty much from like the minute she starts talking to the prospect until project completion, which a sale can take about 6 to 9 months in her
Hmm.
business. She goes, "Is this crazy?" And I said, "Well, first of all, this is normal." And she goes, "Well, I'm really bummed to hear that this is normal. I guess that puts me back in my place." I said, "Hold up." I said it was normal, but that doesn't make it right. I said it's not
Hmm.
right. And here's why. I think when organizations do a disservice to their sales team is when they just increase these targets with absolutely no explanation really of why, other than to grow revenue, which employees don't care, or asking about what is the barrier you might be facing to basically double this revenue target for a person who's been there 10 months. So, Jay, I know you and I have talked about this a lot where you have had similar experiences
Oh,
where
many
revenue
times.
targets are just like they're like confetti dumped on sales
Hmm.
teams. And what we really want to dig into is I told my friend, "I'm sorry this experience happened to you. Our organization is very intentional about sales targets, in the sense that it's a number, but we work backwards then on, okay, what are the performance barriers that we're going to face in order to achieve these targets? Are there efficiencies or tools or any number of things?" And being really intentional about that. So, Jay, I want to like give you a chance to share any tidbits or stories or anecdotes that you might have about why the disparity like maybe exists in the first place. Why, let me just tell you a sales target and go.
Yeah. Well, I think you're going to be surprised by this answer, but in hindsight, in thinking about it, or reflecting is probably a better word. I'm actually grateful that this happened to me for probably 10 plus years in my kind of sales part of my career. But I think that's the reason why I'm so much more strategic and intentional, as you said, with not only us, but also our clients. To your point, I think you handled that very well. I wouldn't say normal per se, but it's very common, is probably the better word that I would think of. And it just,
Much better
again,
word.
I've been in
Agreed.
so many situations where, like, I'll never forget one of actually, it was my second sales job. I worked for MCI WorldCom. Now it's, Verizon. It was the whole Bernie Ebbers madness. And I was one of the top sales guys in Phoenix. And I think, one year I think I did like, I don't know, $4 to $5 million in revenue. And that was a pushing rope uphill situation even to get there. And I hit my numbers. I was beyond exhausted, but I was very motivated, by not only the compensation, but also the recognition. And so when the presentation came out about, the next year's targets, I think they didn't double it because that obviously would have been obscene. But I think they raised my number from like 3.5 million to like, I don't know, 5.5 with no explanation. And what's interesting is putting myself in the shoes and reflecting on that is I found not only myself, but all the other sales team members, all we were doing was complaining and making excuses why this is not realistic and going into the new year with this very kind of negative, toxic mindset. And I think, what I learned from that process is I think, if you are going to have a very aggressive growth, not only I think to your point, you need to explain the why and the path so the people have some level of confidence so they don't spiral and spin out of control and then have imposter syndrome and or leave because they feel like it's unrealistic. But also, I think for me, the part that I loved and learned from the process was is that as a sales leader, the sooner you remove friction and any excuses, I think the more better opportunity you have of making some of this more realistic. And so, what I've always taught other leaders that have kind of an opportunity to set sales targets is you actually, rather than think about it from doing this in December, you actually might want to think about this maybe in like Q3. Because what I always recommend is like Q3 is an interesting one where not only you're thinking about how to wrap up the year in an amazing way and hit your, that year's goals, but also you should start improving the foundation in Q4. So that way, if and when you do announce some larger targets in December or after the holidays, you'd already know that you've already worked through some of those things. Like, is the problem the CRM? Do you not have the sales collateral in place? Or you don't have the right positioning? I think doing all that heavier legwork, I think would be solid around some of that. So again, I'm sorry to hear that your friend is going through this. But unfortunately, I think it's kind of the nature of the beast regarding sales. What I think stinks about it is, at the end of the day, you want your salespeople to make a ton of money because they do well, then the company does well. And what I've seen, unfortunately, what some companies do is they announce these very aggressive targets. For example, if your friend, I don't know, if her goal last year was 1 million and now it's going to be, more than 2 million, if she's going to only earn the same amount of revenue, that's where I think is really defeating to the person, where it's like, I have to work now twice as hard, if not more. And I'm basically, luckily, if I hit these crazy goals, I might actually just make the same amount of money. Like, that's where I think it's kind of crazy. And so I think that when you deliver this kind of news to the sales team, you've got to make sure you're thinking about it from their point of view. And it's like, first of all, we worked the last couple of months on the strategy, and here are the friction points that we've resolved to set you up for success. And oh, by the way, not only are we setting these aggressive goals, we're doing it not only for the company to make more money, but you're going to make twice as much money. And so now your compensation can go from making, $200,000 to 350, whatever the situation might be. So now they're going into it with a much more of a positive mindset. So I think, again, if I was the person that emailed your friend, I would have not only not done this over email, but I would have found a much more effective way at how to tell that story. I think people can get more passionate about kind of like the why and the almost like a GPS mindset when you're driving as far as the path you're going to go down. So it feels like somewhat realistic, this stretch goal.
Yeah, it it was interesting because I shared with her, our annual planning process is pretty intentional and it's actually meant to curb or maybe head off at the pass some of these kinds of bad feelings. And I don't know how many organizations use their annual planning for this kind of purpose. And as you mentioned, like starting a little earlier in Q3 is helpful. And, to some extent, you need to have some time to strategize for your next year. It feels hard to do that sometimes in annual planning because it's just a very tactical time,
Hmm.
but it's also then I think it's requiring you to, okay, think at the end of next year, where are you going to be? And so your brain is struggling to be in two places at once. At least mine does, where I have to kind of compartmentalize, okay, the goal for the year is blank, and then let's work backwards from that. Now Q1 is blank, and let's work backwards from that. And so, I think doing that this last week was really helpful because we trimmed our goals to be more not aspirational, but just less solve world hunger and more let's solve our company problem. And,
Yep.
hopefully Scott is like finally and patting himself on the back, like, all right, we got there. Like we aren't
We listen.
writing these. I don't know. We'll find out. But being really intentional, which the other word is strategic, but it gets misrepresented and misused, is if that were a request of our organization, like we need to really scale up our sales targets or revenue targets, I think the first thing you need to answer is the why. People deserve
Hmm.
to know why. And I've had other friends, same thing, bigger companies asked to just explode these targets. And, to your point, Jay, about the morale just was crushed before the year even started. They all knew that there was absolutely no physical way, or at least they couldn't see the way to achieve those targets. And so almost before they started, they had just kind of started coasting because they were like, well, I'm not getting the incentives, the bonuses, I'm not getting the recognition. So, you know what? I'm just going to do my best because anything less than this is unacceptable. And so why put in all the extra effort and stress? I'll just do what I did last year and, at least I'm even and I'm going to move on. And I
I
think that's
love
the
that.
first thing is like the why and the explanation and getting your team on board, all of them, to understand the reasoning because you want to, I guess, galvanize, to borrow I think it's a Lencioni word and Working Genius,
Hmm.
um, galvanize the team around a revenue target.
What's interesting, Sarah, as you're sort of talking, and I love where I think you're going with this, but as you were saying, like the why, which I obviously alluded to, I strongly agree with you on that. But also, I think there's a when element here. And as you were talking, I remembered, gosh, probably about a week ago, I'm obviously a huge fan of Vern Harnish. Obviously, beyond thrilled that he agreed to write the foreword in our new book, Revenue Rewired. Those that haven't gotten it, please go and check it out. I thought the way he worded the summary of the book, I thought, or introducing the book, was so awesome. But I'm a huge fan of his and his kind of thought leadership. And we as we were going into our annual planning process, which typically we do in December, we kind of did a funky one this year. We did part in December and part in January to finalize it. But the when part is what I wanted to kind of introduce. And I think again, it all depends on the organization, how your leadership is structured, and then how the people that are doing the actual work on the marketing and or sales side, what they're involved in. Because the when part of when you do this, I think can make a significant impact. But what Vern talked about, and again, I'm sure it's probably because I was, watching his video and, my phone is listening to me and I was on, I don't know, YouTube or TikTok or whatever nonsense I was on. He shared a video that talked all about what he was recognizing one of his peers. And he suggested that you don't do annual planning typically in December or January. You actually wait till like the solstice, like do this in March. And his point was the concept around that was, in the winter, people are still hibernating, and they're, still doing so many things and either wrapping up the year trying to get to that finish line and or when they just get back from the holidays, their brain is a little slow still from, you know, eggnog and whatever the situation might be over the holidays. But I thought it was a really interesting perspective. I don't really have a strong feeling either way, but I think if your team is so heads down and trying to hit their current goals, asking them to slow down and now and think about next year, it's literally like changing your tire as you're driving. And so I thought it was really interesting where, to my point before, I mean, you know me, Sarah, I'm always thinking about goals. I'm very aspirational. I have the next 3 years mapped out in my head already. I always doing that. And it's constantly evolving. But I think when you have to involve the team, it's like, how do you avoid the least amount of friction or distraction? And then when the best is to do this, and maybe the mindset might be is, look, we got to keep our team focused on doing what they're currently doing and, maintain status quo to hit our current numbers before introducing this whole new, Grand Canyon, chasm type of situation. So maybe it's that leadership team has kind of their high level targets. They have the why figured out. They recognize what gaps they might have to make any of this even somewhat realistic. And then maybe they start setting the strategy in place in Q4 and Q1 to be getting all that in place. And then maybe holding off on setting any big aggressive numbers to maybe like a March timeframe to impact the remaining part of the year. Again, even from the accounting perspective, I know so many organizations that don't even close their books until like end of January, early February at the earliest sometimes to wrap up the prior year. And so if you go into annual planning in December and there's so many other gaps in place around how are we even currently doing from the financial point of view and what we actually need to hit our profitability goals for the next year, I think it's kind of a really stressful situation. And so, end of the day, if you can add some joy, maybe even fun, into this process to get people excited about it and everyone kind of heading to the same true north, I feel like you have a much more healthy chance of making this even somewhat realistic and celebrating some of the success that you had from the prior year. But again, if you're still trying to wrap up the current year and then you enter into like your friend situation of saying, hey, you did 1 million last year, now you got to do 2.5 the next year, and we don't really know how you're going to get it, but you just got to do it, or else you're going to lose your job, kind of the fear mindset. I think it's a very negative point of view. So I think the when and taking a strategic approach of when you do all this and then who, as far as who you involve in the company. I think you have the why, the when, and the who. I think if you have those three parts at least in place, I think it's just a much more of exciting kind of conversation to have. I don't know if you agree with that.
To, absolutely. Like the other part of me is the operator, and the ask is asking them to scale their outcomes. But are you, as an organization, ready to help scale what's necessary to scale their outcomes? Like, for example,
Hmm.
we've seen this all the time, the like ghost handoff. If you've got a quantity game and you are, maybe haven't evaluated the quality, you're basically just asking to throw more. So it's like throwing more sand into what are those timers, those sand timers. It's
Hmm.
not coming out any faster at the end. So where is the bottleneck there with the quantity? Are there operational opportunities? This is where the good things of AI can come in and help, expedite some of the parts of your sales process. And then, the morale piece, it could be really detrimental, and you could end up losing high performers who are like, yeah, listen, I bent over backwards, but I'm not really sure how this is all tying together. I'm feeling a little disconnected from the organization. And no matter what people say and what motivates them, it really is hard to work when you don't have a lot of purpose. And at least are bought in. You don't have to necessarily be like, marketing is my purpose. But if you aren't bought into the outcomes of the organization, then you feel like a cog, and you just, it's really hard to get excited and want to hit those stretch goals when you don't have any extra resources. And it's just like you're a human being asked to do more with less. Nobody likes that. And so I think there's like a lot of other tiny pieces of revenue soul-sucking opportunities that come out of just asking for higher revenue targets.
Yeah. I mean, again, as you kind of already alluded to, for those that haven't read our book or really heard about the Revenue Rewired book, Sarah, as you were talking, it's interesting how many of the five bottlenecks that we have talked about in the book are so impacted by these targets, realistic or not. Again, like I think, one of the issues is like on the reactive rhythm is one of the bottlenecks that we talk about in the book. Again, I unfortunately, to your point, I've been involved in so many kind of sales organizations, either being inside of them as an employee and or as a consultant, helping companies around their sales infrastructure and organizational structure and accountability matrix and blah, blah, blah. I have seen, to your point, sadly, people leave companies and they don't always blame this for being the reason, but it's shocking to me within, 45 to 60 days after the next year's targets are announced, when you end up losing some people, typically it's the A players and then the C players. The C players leave because they're like, there's no freaking way, being that I was so off from hitting last year's goals, that I have any chance of hitting these goals next year. So I'm just going to peace out and go find another job. But then the A players leave because they don't understand the purpose and the why behind, making their lives even harder. And that's where I think it's a huge issue around like the metrics misfire part of things where if you set up these random numbers, and there's no compelling story and strategy around how you're going to get there. Now, all of a sudden, you're focusing on these things, and maybe you do actually have a great year where you actually did 20% better than the prior year, but you're still going to feel so bad at the end of the year because not only did that salesperson make a ton less money if they didn't hit their new crazy targets, but also like the gap between what you landed on and what the goal was is just going to be a very negative mindset. So then, of course, what's going to happen is they're going to set up crazier goals the next year. And then it's just like domino or house of cards situation going on. And so, again, I think that what I have seen some organizations do that I think is pretty smart is if there's a why behind setting some really aggressive goals, and hopefully they're explained well so that people understand, the reason behind this aggressive goal. There should be some metrics in place to help measure some of this so you can learn from it. So if you're going to set another aggressive goal the next year, you hopefully can be like, okay, well, this is what we learned the prior year. And either was it a process issue or people or go to market positioning or tactics or whatever the situation might be, there should be some metrics in place, not only analyzing, how you're doing on the revenue and the number of deals and meetings and whatnot, but other things in place so you can learn from the market, and the various different departments, to figure out how you can really improve and tighten things up. Again, back to the excuses part, like I mentioned before, because typically I find that often is a big factor of why things aren't going the way they're going. And then also you have like, the reactive rhythm side where everyone's just reacting to this and everyone's heading in different directions. And now all of a sudden, by you doubling the number that you're aiming for, everyone's a freaking hot mess. And then you have so many different data points in place, and you have no idea what the issue is and why you aren't doing what you're hoping to set out to do. So I just think it's a huge disappointment to me when I see, pretty solid organizations, someone on the leadership team's like, hey, last year we did 43 million. Next year we're going to do 55. And again, I have seen numerous companies that were able to do that. But there has to be something around it. Like, are they acquiring to get to that? And they bought some other organization and bought a book of a business, and that's how they're going to get, 10 million of the 15 million gap, whatever it might be. But I just feel like there needs to be some kind of strategy in place before you just, take a dart and throw it at the wall and, and whatever you land on is the goal.
Well, goals without resourcing are it's just pressure. Let me play devil's advocate for a second, because as you were talking, I was like, oh, I could so see a
Oh, here we
situation
go.
where someone says, hey, that's great. You do a lot of sharing. You guys sound like a kumbaya type of place. We are not that place. I set the target, it gets achieved. There's a lot of higher level conversations that many of my large team is not privy to. You know, is there still a place where this can be shared safely? Like, I wonder if we, because we're an entrepreneurial type of organization and our heads, our hearts, and our actual business, that we are more open to sharing than some of the other places like you may have worked.
Oh, 100%. I mean, again, I've worked at, companies that had, I don't know, 45,000 employees. And you are right. There is an element of the more enterprise the company is and the more layers or disconnects you have between the some, CEO, COO leadership team that set targets. And then this weird cascading effect where it goes from them down to senior VPs, down to VPs, down to directors, and then managers, and then the reps. And it's like after six, levels of playing a bad, telephone game, it does get really washed out and it gets very confusing. But that's really where I think, makes a good company great is the ones that are very entrepreneurial still, and they understand that there's humans involved here. And so, again, there are many organizations that are very large, and the leadership team is so solid, and they have not just the empathy, but they understand, how hard some of this is. They do a decent job, and you could simply create like a 15-minute video explaining some of this regarding, hey, let's kind of talk for a few minutes about how the year went, what we learned from it, explain the vision. Then you can go through some of the overarching strategies that you're planning for the next year. And then that helps drive why we need to have the metrics we do. Now, that being said, if it's a publicly traded company, obviously there's a lot of compliance elements in place here. So I'm just talking broad. And also, again, our ideal clients are mid-market. And so I think to your point, Sarah, you know, I less frequently see this kind of challenge with companies that are, 15 million to 250 million. Again, obviously the higher the company is and the more spread out they are around geography and markets and whatnot, obviously the harder this is to kind of help tell a story. But my point is, no matter how big the company is, there's always some effective way to be able to explain some element of the why, the who, and the when type of stuff to the people that you're relying on. Because again, and imagine if you're I don't know, a $1.6 billion company and you announce you're going to want to go to 2 billion. Percentage wise, that might not sound too crazy, but that's a significant number. And if you have mass exodus and or toxic situation going on internally, and you don't realize that for a quarter or two, the chances now of you getting there in the remaining part of the calendar year is quite a challenge. And obviously, you could hire a bunch of people to get you there, but then all of a sudden now it's a negative situation on the P&L because now all of a sudden you have to hire people, and as we know, when you hire new salespeople, it's amazing to me how some leaders think, oh, I'm going to hire this person. They have a book of business, and in 30 days, they'll be producing. It's amazing to me how much longer things take, even with a very skilled, experienced salesperson. I've seen companies where it could take 6+ months before that person gets into a rhythm and starts really producing to the goals that the company is, desiring from that person. So, yes, I know I'm woo-woo sometimes and very aspirational that I feel like this is possible. I know there's a lot of unique cases regarding publicly traded companies and or companies that are spread out globally. But I feel like those are often the outliers and not really who our audience is focused on. But I feel like if you're a mid-market or small to mid-sized business, doing, I don't know, 10 to $200 million a year, I think there's no reason why you couldn't at least embrace some of what we're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, aspirational doesn't mean impossible, but
Hmm.
you just got to help people understand. So,
Yep.
all right, Jay. Well, this was a fun topic. I know we love talking about sales, but we're marketers, so we're trying not to show any bias. We talk about both sides. But we hope you all enjoyed this episode. As always, if you have questions, please maybe maybe try to stump Jay. That would be a fun one. So if you want to do that, reach out to us, get a
Great.
call scheduled.
That's the new game.
That's right.
The
That's
Stump
right. I'm
J.
putting it out there. All
Oh my
right.
God, I
Have a
love it.
great day, everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Revenue Rewired podcast. Send us your questions to podcast@stringcaninteractive.com and follow us for more insights to drive your business forward.